Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here in WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. We are taking a short break from our interview with candidates before the primary this week to speak with Amanda Kay Gustin, who is the Director of Collections and Access for the Vermont Historical Society. So glad you can be joining us today, Amanda.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro, is here. Hi, Emily.
Hi, so good to be here.
And yeah, I am so excited. So Amanda is here today to how perfect, Emily, for a show that talks about stories. We're going to be talking about Vermont stories, particularly how the hippies saved Vermont, which I think is probably the shorthand. A lot of people know of the population boom we had in Vermont in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, many of whom were folks who were part of the counterculture movement. And near us in Windham County, we had Packard's Corner, which was one of the communes. And then over in my neck of the woods, I don't remember their names, but there were a few communes as well over kind of the Mass line, Vermont line area. So before we jump in, I want to ask Emily. So as I know it, I know the story as the hippies saved Vermont. I'm never told what they saved Vermont from, per se, but they saved Vermont. I'm curious for you, Emily, because you arrived in Vermont later than I did. What's the story you've heard?
I'm so excited about this question. So first, I want to say, I think this is actually perfectly appropriate to have in the middle of our election season coverage, because the conversation about who's from here and who's not, and
Good
what
point.
who are not from here deserve or don't deserve, I think is a ever present conversation in Vermont, very specific to the time period we're talking about with Amanda. And as I knock on doors, comes up over and over and over again. So I'm glad that we're talking about it now. I also want to say that I believe there were at least 15 communes in Brattleboro and Marlborough during that time, including on Bonnyvale Road, like right really next to where I live. So Packers Corner is something we still talk about, but there were really quite a few. There was full feminist separatist commune called the Red Something Collective that was, I think, on like the Ames Hill area maybe, and yeah, all kinds of fun. So there's a weird background noise thing.
I don't know what's causing that. I'm sorry, folks.
Okay. So I think for me, what it sort of all means and what the hippie saving Vermont is that at that same time period, we were sort of, and I'm curious to hear from Amanda more than me, who actually knows this stuff, but my understanding is that as sort of, industry lessened across the country, we were seeing a big migration of folks who were born here, moving out of the state in search of economic opportunities. And we were sort of a, aging state without many opportunities for the young, and with an economy that we weren't quite sure what direction it should go in. And I think there's a lot of relevance for this moment we're in now, as those folks who moved here then have aged, and as the economy that they built is sort of transitioning out of their leadership. And so I'm curious. Yeah, I'm really excited to dive in today.
So how about for you, Amanda? Like, is that kind of the stories you hear too, or what's your thoughts? What's your response?
Yeah. So I think that maybe one of the things that would be useful is explaining some of my framing when I think about history. I I never think of history in terms of turning points or this is the decade that did this or that. I tend to be a sort of a long view historian. And then you look out of the course of 100 years, you can find inflection points where things bubble to the surface in interesting ways because a lot of things have all come together in that moment. It doesn't mean they happened in that moment. It means that there was a big background swelling that happened to become apparent. Arguably, we're living in one right now, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and I find it fascinating to listen to some of the things you name, Emily, because in the 1820s, people were terrified about young people leaving Vermont and there not being the right kind of industry or economy for the state. There were genuine fears about, oh, all our best and brightest are migrating west for new opportunities, and we're left with whoever has stayed. There have been actual like theses written on this. You can find rhetoric and campaigning in the 1910s and 1920s, similarly about opportunity for young people and industry and so on and so forth. And so the 1970s, we look back on that now as a time of seeing a similar conversation, a similar change. And I think a lot of people look at the 1970s as one of those moments of change. And interesting, your question, how the hippies saved Vermont. I've also heard of it as how they ruined Vermont. That is another version of that I have heard. But I can go into a lot of those long sort of patterns in the background and so on. Else, briefly on population, you're right that there was population boom 60s, 70s, and 80s. Vermont's population, roughly since that 1820s, 1830s period, had largely stayed relatively stagnant, like quote unquote replacement level. People being born as people passed away or moved out or moved in as they moved away and kind of stuff. Pretty much stagnant until the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So there was a significant population growth. Around 1960, the population of the state was around 400,000, and we're around 650 now. So that's a sizable increase. I've played with the math a little bit on this, and there's a couple of interesting things. This is the time period where Chittenden County starts to break away from the rest of the state in population. Mm-hmm. It's no longer an evenly distributed population increase where you have different centers of commerce and economy and population in the state. It starts to become a Chittenden County population growth, not exclusively, but very, very strongly. So this is when that really becomes the population center of Vermont. I think we're so used to thinking of it that way that maybe we don't realize that this is the moment when that really takes off. It's been edging that way for a little while. And another is that when you look at that population growth, I think some of it is absolutely explained by what we would call in-migration. But I think the bulk of it, the underlying factors, are two big things. They are the baby boom, generally. There was just a lot more people, a lot more human beings. And the IBM plant comes to Essex Junction. That is an almost overnight, huge, thousands and thousands of people. I saw a statistic that said that at its peak, it employed 8,500 people in Essex Junction. When you think about all of those people maybe having 5 or 6 additional family members with them, that right there, that's the nexus of your population increase. It's spread out over time. It doesn't explain all of it. But when you sort of math out maybe how many people came to Vermont specifically to participate in a counterculture activity, whether that was a commune or something else, it's much smaller relative to a lot of other things going
on. Before you jump in there, Emily, I was reading through some of the materials that the Vermont Historical Society has on its website about this time. And one thing that stood out to me was you talked about industry changing, how a lot of the textile mills and other forms of industry were fading away, and what sort of came in its place as far as big industries was IBM and the ski industry. And I find those fascinating because as far as workers in those industries, I'm not sure they're equal as far as like pay and benefits and that type of thing. I found that interesting as someone who lives in a ski area. Go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna be excited about sort of Amanda pointing out that in some ways the whole thing is a myth. The myth is a myth. and I'd be curious to see what like census data around incomes look like around that time, because are we seeing an increasing divide class-wise in Vermont, whereas we might have had sort of like a solid working class, middle class up until that point, and now we are seeing a division between sort of like an upper middle class employed in the Chittenden County area, and then the rest of us working service jobs. It's really interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know that data. I haven't seen that data, but I bet you could put it together, and I bet it would be extremely interesting, because I think you're also starting to, this is the very beginning of when you're starting to lose, every town has its grocery store, hardware store, etc. And this is also sort of, the dairy industry had been declining, and larger agricultural enterprises had been declining for some time, arguably since like the 1880s, 1890s. And then they got hit hard again with the introduction of the bulk tanks around the middle of the century, and that pushed a lot more dairy farmers to say, you know what, I'm done. This is no longer a feasible way to make a living for me. And you really start to see it by the 1960s. We're still talking about it today, right? We're still losing dairy farms, but we have been losing dairy farms for a long time, unfortunately. And we've also been changing our land use for a long time. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that Vermont started marketing itself as a place for second homeowners to take advantage of quote unquote abandoned farms in the 1880s.
Mhm.
There was actually a state level initiative to produce pamphlets for people from New York or Boston to buy sort of camps or farms to come spend time in, back that far. And it was a state sponsored initiative. And that's the beginning of when we see a lot of that land that had been cleared through the 19th century for larger scale farming purposes that starts to grow back in, right? We talk about Vermont as something like 80 to 90% deforested throughout the 19th century. And by the 1960s and 70s, it is pretty much reversed, because a lot of that land that had been cleared for agricultural purposes has grown back.
So that recruitment or marketing push, I've learned in the last few years that that was very quite explicitly tailored to a particular flavor of white folks.
Yeah, we actually published Paul Searles at I almost said Linden State, Vermont State University at Linden, who's a wonderful, really excellent Vermont historian, has written extensively on this, and we published a book by him a couple of years ago called Repeopling Vermont, in which he goes into this in depth, because the same guy who was responsible for sort of marketing these, again, I use quote unquote abandoned farms, because Paul will point out that every time you see one of these farms for sale, that's a family's heartbreak, right? That's a multi-generational farm that has gone under, and people have had to change their way of life when they left it. He points out that the guy who was in charge, whose first name I'm not remembering, his last name was Valentine, in charge of marketing these farms, also had a scheme in which he was recruiting people from Sweden to come live in Vermont, because he felt that demographically, racially, culturally, religion-wise, they lined up with what he believed would be the ideal Vermonter, which leads us logically into the rise of the eugenics program in the late 19th, early 20th century here in Vermont. About, as you were saying earlier, Emily, about who is a real Vermonter? What should a Vermonter look like? How do they fit in with the Vermont that's already here, rather than how do we welcome them and make our Vermont a more flexible place to live?
Mhm. And who did you say wrote that book, Repeopling Vermont?
Paul Searles, Searls. He's a really, really superb Vermont historian. And he talks a lot about the ways, it's sort of his first book was, I'm looking at it over there on my shelf. I'm looking for it over my shelf. It's called Two Vermonts. And it's
Right.
about sort of class and landscape change in the 19th century of Vermont. And sort of he continues some of those those economic history and social history themes from roughly the 1880s to like the 1930s in this next book, Repeopling Vermont.
Okay. If I can find links to the books online, I'll include them in the show notes for books.
And I think we've talked about that book before on the show when we were talking about the hill people and the valley people.
think
Do you remember that
was that
that was
two
like,
Vermonts? Yeah, I think so.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a really good, and it goes back to, right, like Ethan Allen is famously supposed to have said the gods of the hills are not the gods of the valleys. Like he was already drawing that poetic distinction, um, back in the late 18th century.
Hmm. So, Amanda, bringing this back to the core of what we were talking about the influx of population and that story of the hippies save Vermont or they ruined Vermont, depending on who you ask. Um, what for you as you were working on some of these materials and going through this history, what did you have any aha moments yourself?
Um, I should first say that this project was led a couple of years ago by our then curator, Jackie Calder. I worked on it alongside her, and I have sort of since inherited that research with her retirement. But this was sort of her brainstorm. She got into it by studying food co-op history and realized how many food co-ops were founded right around this time period and wondering why, and going from there to organic farming and the development of a sort of a localvore sensibility around that. For me personally, I was not alive in the 1970s. I give the talk now for people. I'm like, I was not there. So I'm looking back on this often to people who do remember the 1970s. Uh, so I think for me, in a way, it's easier to think of it as a longer wave. I think probably if you lived through it, it probably did feel like a lot was going on at once, a lot was all changing along at once. And counterculture was one of the most visible things that was in your face changing. And we can get into, we had a whole file of letters complaining to Governor Dean Davis at the time in the late 60s, early 70s about the quote unquote influx of hippies that were coming to Vermont. And there's some really interesting reasons those stories get started. Uh, so for me, it's interesting to see people look back and think back about that as this moment of perfect, huge change when that's not how it feels to me, not having lived through it.
Interesting. Um, yeah, I'm curious. I'd love to hear more about the letters to Dean Davis. Yeah, that fascinates me.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on here, and this little like rabbit hole of a story is one of my favorite things that we unraveled during this project, which is that you often hear the statistic tossed out of 50,000 hippies are coming to Vermont. And it's often this very specific number of 50,000. And there's this huge correspondence in the early 1970s, like 71 and 72. 50,000 hippies are coming, 50,000 hippies are coming. They always name that number. It's always this summer. He gets a lot of really angry letters. Stop it, fix it. He has to issue a press release saying we're ready. People can only camp at the state parks if they have a reservation. I've alerted the state police. It's this really fascinating press release. And so we started digging in, where does this number come from? What does this 50,000 number come from? And our best track of this is that in 1970, a couple of law students, I believe it was at Yale, in one of the Yale law publications, not the Yale Law Review, but a different one, wrote this article that sort of explored the idea of states' rights, local control. What would it really take to change a place, especially a small place? How many people could in a place could like change something? And in a footnote, they name a couple of states with a relatively small population where a relatively small number of people going in could achieve some kind of tipping point difference. This article is called Jamestown 70, by the way. And in that footnote, one of the states out of I think 5 or 6 that they name is Vermont. And this gets picked up in this sort of like weird cultural zeitgeist way. And it crashes into a couple of really interesting things. One of them is the 26th Amendment, which gives the vote to 18-year-olds. Vermont has a lot more colleges then than it does now. And right around the time, the spring of 1972, that the 26th Amendment passes, and we're getting ready to, spring of 1971, that the 26th Amendment passes, and they're getting ready for the next election, which will feature 18-year-olds, there's an article in Playboy magazine in 1972 called Taking Over Vermont. And it posits two things. It posits, first of all, that there are already something like 50,000 hippies in Vermont, with, as far as I can tell, no actual evidence, just vibes. And it describes a lot of like the more visible elements of counterculture, like your prominent communes, larger music festivals. Goddard College gets a mention, as it often does in these stories. And sort of these things collide with a newly reapportioned Vermont legislature, which now is being elected by different districts in different ways. And all of this seems to come to a head in a committee meeting in 1972, when the member from Plainfield is discussing both this influx of people and the 18-year-old voting. I believe his name was Tibbetts, and he has Goddard College in his district. And he, in this committee meeting, is getting really upset and really concerned that he's going to get voted out. Because all these people are coming. Now we've given 18-year-olds the vote. I've got all these Goddard College students. Do they really represent, as we were talking earlier, are they real Vermonters? Just because they're here for college and they're now 18 and they can vote, you've just entered this whole new voting block of people who may not really be from here into the world. So all of these things sort of crash, and you get this huge bubble of stories claiming that 50,000 hippies are coming to Vermont explicitly with the goal of taking over Vermont. It didn't really happen. Yeah, a lot of people came to Vermont. I don't want to, in my contextualizing this, I don't want to discount that a lot of people did come to Vermont for reasons adjacent to or directly part of the counterculture, for sure. Mm-hmm. But this moment seems to have all come out of this sort of chain of circumstances. And then what do you get in the actual elections of 1972? You do get the youngest class of legislators ever. And you get both Jim Douglas and Madeline Kunin newly elected in that 1972 election. So a diversifying of the legislature, a younger legislature, and a legislature that contains two future governors. Neither of whom, as far as I can tell, have any association with the counterculture, but both of whom are on the young side for legislators and are a little bit part of the same conversation, right? They're new voices and new younger voices.
Thank you for going down that rabbit hole. That was so fascinating.
It really was.
Now, of course, I guess we can say when people say they read Playboy just for the articles, we can ask those legislators in that committee meeting, like, oh, were you reading the Playboy for the articles about taking over Vermont? Sorry, I'm being cheeky.
That's what we're here for.
What I loved about going down that rabbit hole is it just, I think for me, highlights how stories get started and how they can snowball and create their own momentum with everything else that's sort of Velcroing onto them. Emily,
I also want to, so it's sort of in thinking about Madeline Kunin or Douglas being elected, very different politics on the two of them. But I think one thing that gets sort of lost in the conversation about the zeitgeist or the migration is how there were young people already living here or older people living here who might have been from here, even putting that in air quotes for folks on the radio, who learned from that movement, who integrated from that movement, who joined the counterculture or helped teach the counterculture or were really, part of that. And when talking to folks, both who, boomers who grew up here, who really identify with that movement, or folks who came here, my ex-in-laws were from Jersey and came here, for communes and back to the land and the kingdom. The relationships that they formed with locals were a huge part of their experience here, and sort of the respect that they had for how folks here were already doing things, and integrating with communities being important to them. And so I'm curious, just your sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. This is something, and I should say that part of the project that I referenced earlier is that we collected, believe it or not, being 82 oral history interviews with people who experienced the counterculture in Vermont in the 1970s. And we talked to many, many, many hundreds more. We actually did a forum in Brattleboro that was like an open mic night to tell your stories of the counterculture. It was a blast. And we heard both people who had moved here, who had like just one day they woke up on their college campus and they drove to Vermont and ended up at a commune and stayed. All right, that's one of your extremes. But we also heard from people, one person who we didn't interview, but was just talking to me about the project. So yeah, I moved up here when my husband got a job at UVM, and I was raising kids throughout the whole 1970s. I didn't think of myself as part of this, but I was realizing when we were talking about this project, that's when I got really into grinding my own flour. And I was part of before food co-ops were a storefront, they were a true like buying co-op, bulk buy co-op. You would go to a parking lot and fill your car with whatever you had portioned out in your bulk buy. And she got connected to that. So she came up for totally different reasons, totally quote unquote typical reasons, and very much was part of that experience. And you see that. You see folks who come up for other reasons, for IVM, who take part in this. And you also see people who are multi-generational Vermonters, who live down the road from a commune, who get very connected to them. In your Brattleboro area, Ron Squires, who was a legislator in the early 1990s, right? Again, multi-generational farmer, the Squires family dairy farms, but he ends up becoming close friends with the Packers Corner folks, and then goes on to become a legislator. Vermont's first openly gay legislator. Is actually an incredible story. But so you see both people who are already living here and get connected to the counterculture, people who come here for other reasons, who are participating in, like, this is a national movement. This is not exclusively Vermont. It tends to be named as a frequent place where there are the counterculture, but it's not exclusive to Vermont. And I think another thing you see is oftentimes people who moved here, maybe not even a true full back to the land commune, but just to have a small farm or something like that, to quote unquote go back to the land or live on the land. And the back to the land movement in Vermont actually starts in the 1920s, but that's a whole nother conversation. We have stories of them saying, the people of my age in Vermont maybe were not as interested in me. They wanted to get out of Vermont. They were not interested in this. Maybe their parents or their grandparents who grew up farming with horses and who grew up in a sort of pre-pesticide agricultural world, a pre-modern, quote unquote, modern agricultural world, they were thrilled and they shared their skills with us. And they taught us how to live through the winter and split enough wood to figure out the wood stove. And we had one story of a guy who was trying to figure exactly what he was trying to do. I think he was trying to plow with horses and just doing a terrible job at it. And the farmer from down the road, who was long retired, could come down and just watch him every day because it was very amusing to him. He finally said, all right, well, now I can't do this anymore. Let me show you what you're actually supposed to do with that. And how many of them, not that many of them, if any, really became going agricultural concerns. Some of them transitioned to other farms under maybe a single member of the commune or the community, moved on. But those skills were passed down by the previous generations.
Thank you. We need to take a break to hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. But stay tuned. Amanda, Emily, and I shall return. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro, and Amanda Kay Gustin, who's the Director of Collections and Access at the Vermont Historical Society. And we've been talking broadly about the story or the myth or the belief of how the hippies saved Vermont in the 1970s. Before we dive back in, I want to thank BCTV for sharing the video version of this show with PEG stations around Vermont. And Emily, what do we remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, respectively, not the station, nor the... What is it? What do I say next? I'll just stop there.
The stations, the platforms, anywhere you might hear this. It's just us. Thank you, Emily.
Mhm.
So, Amanda, you gave us this beautiful rundown of some of all the different things that collided in the around the 1960s, 1970s in Vermont, and how we had that rather large population shift. But the other thing that shifted around this time, as I understand it, was the politics of Vermont. Would you kind of pull that apart for us? What changed and what sort of set that snowball rolling?
Yeah. Vermont, what I think what a lot of people don't necessarily think about or realize is that, and I'm going to be describing things in terms of the party systems as they existed at the time,
Mhm.
which has changed over the course of the 20th century. But Vermont was effectively the most reliably solid red Republican state in the country from 1860 to about 1960. It voted against Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. It it was just sort of part of that bloc, and that it started with the Lincoln Republican Party. And one of the reasons I specifically name the party shift and the party changes and the party systems that we've experienced a lot of different ones over the course of American history, right? Vermont had a lot of different political parties before 1860. Is that starting about the 1930s, this starts to break down. And I want to name the scholarship of Sam Hand, a longtime UVM professor, whose book, The Star That Set, is a phenomenal sort of political history of Vermont from about 1860 to about, I think it goes to like 1980. And he explores the way the Republican Party in Vermont functioned during that time, and specifically the mountain rule, which you may have heard of. Often it gets most referenced as like you always had to have a governor from the left side of the mountains and the right side of the mountains, back and forth. You had to balance that out. You had to have a senator from the left side of the mountains and the right side of the mountains, and balance that out. When we had more than one member of Congress, member of the House, you had to balance it out. It also actually encompassed a sort of way you were expected to participate in the Vermont political system in ways you sort of moved up the quote unquote ladder from rep to speaker to lieutenant governor to governor. And then you were only supposed to get 2 terms as governor, and then you were supposed to retire. And this is sort of like internally enforced. And this starts to break down in all these interesting, small, subtle ways. The first time a governor returns after more than 2 terms is in 1927. After the flood. And I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. I'm sorry about that. It'll come to me in a minute. But
We even
Governor
read his
then,
speech, didn't we? Was it
We've
Hopper?
read
Hooper?
we've read a few of his speeches. I don't remember at
Hoffer?
all.
I can't believe I'm blanking on it. Come to me in a minute. But anyway, he runs again saying, like, we just experienced a massive flood. Stay on the horse that's in the race kind of argument. And then in the 1930s, there's a special elections for a Senate seat. And for the first time in 75 years, the Democrat comes really close to Warren Austin, who becomes senator at that time and is one of our fascinating Vermont political figures. And then it sort of slowly continues, and a couple of things come into play in the 1960s. That population shift increase in Chittenden County is one of those things. And then there's a Supreme Court case in 1962 called Baker v. Carr. And there's been a lot of really interesting, there's a Radio Lab episode on this whole thing. But basically it says that state houses have to be proportionate to population. Previous to that time, Vermont had a House member for every single town in Vermont. And the figures that are often named is that Stratton with 38 people had 1 member and Burlington had 1 member.
Wait, can I ask a question about that before you go on? So
Yeah.
I've heard multiple times State House myth. And while I'm talking, I just want to say, I think that like expectation of 2 years for the governor and moving up the ladder is still very much with us. Even if it's not something we follow, I think people still get outraged when someone doesn't engage in either of those 2 things. But I've heard that essentially, especially in the smaller towns, like people would basically like, if there was someone they wanted to get out of town because they were the town drunk or the town reprobate, they would send them to the State House. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you have heard, Amanda.
I've heard that story.
You also heard that, Olga?
Yep.
I have not heard that. I have heard of towns so small that they basically had to like pick the short straw to go to Montpelier. You traded it around because with only 38 people, like how many people can there really be to choose from to go to Montpelier? I haven't heard that one. I would be curious if there's any even like quiet newspaper articles or editorials that might some evidence of that.
Was it John E. Weeks Johnny Weeks
Thank you.
was the governor.
Thank you. We were stuck on Percival Clement, who was a couple of years earlier. Too many governors. And there was a stretch in the 19th century, they only got 1-year terms. So that got hectic. So 1960s, 1962, Baker v. Carr forces essentially the reapportionment of the Vermont legislature. And it was a massive change. And it was not by any means an easy vote. It had to happen, right? It was just a matter of like how it happened. But that is as close to it as overnight a change as we get. That was what swings the legislature to the population centers of Vermont, which is right a proportionate representation, which was the goal of that Supreme Court case. And that is as close as we get to an overnight political change in Vermont. It does not, however, just automatically make Vermont not Republican anymore. It doesn't automatically change its politics. We do get the state's first Democratic governor, Phil Hoff, in 1965, largely on the strength of those population centers of Chittenden County, which are starting to really show their political muscle, as we described earlier, in terms of just numbers and population-wise. But it is still a majority Republican legislature right through Cunin, frankly. It has a majority Republican legislature for, I think, all of her term. And then its control has shifted back and forth through the 90s and the early 2000s. And for that matter, one of the things I always point out to people is that Vermont's Republican Party didn't really, at the time in the 1960s, we have the huge party shift nationally, in which the Southern strategy sort of breaks that part of the Republican Party from I won't go into the whole thing, but the Republican Party shifts nationally, and Vermont's Republican Party had never really aligned with that for at least probably another 2 decades, at least it took for that shift to reach Vermont. So you get people like a George Aiken, who is a Vermont Republican senator, who is responsible for crafting national food supplement and food stamps legislation. And you got a Robert Stafford, who is responsible for the student loans that bear his name, and so on and so forth, coming out of Vermont. So there's this whole mix, which is very, very long and perhaps overly contextual way of saying that it's not like someone flipped a switch and all the hippies came and voted, and all of a sudden Vermont became liberal. They were part of a sort of slow, long shift in Vermont history that became apparent with a couple of more significant shifts in the 1960s. And that still took another couple of decades to play out. So.
Mm-hmm. What's resonating for you, Emily, as someone who serves in the legislature, kind of hearing this shifting of history?
It just like brings into, we started this show, 6 years ago because of all of these stories that shape everything that we both knew were myths. And I think we're diving in with Amanda on like some of the very strongest myths that shape a lot of like direct state house conversations that folks often, and I think the thing that I'm struck with is sometimes some of my colleagues will sort of reference a particular turning point in the legislature or a particular time the body flipped majority or minority as because of one vote or one bill. And then that reality that they're carrying around really informs how they vote on other bills or how they shape politics. And it's just the world is a more complex place than that. And when I say something like, I think the world's a more complex place than that, like I sound like a jerk. So I try not to say that. But sort of another big example for me is, I think Take Back Vermont and Act 60 are really, really connected to each other, but everyone always thinks of Take Back Vermont only in the context of gay rights and civil unions. And I just like, maybe that's my obsession with education finance, but I also think it's just that the world is a complex place and people react to that complexity in different ways. So That was a little bit of a monologue, and I'm realizing since this show is the first thing I've done today that my summer cold is making me a little weird. And so I'm going to stop talking and pass it back over to you without a question.
Summer colds are the worst. They always
Uh-huh.
they always hit us where it hurts. Well, I think what resonates for me, what you just said, Emily, maybe this is a little bit off topic, but having my writing life in both the journalism camp and the fiction writing camp, I'm always kind of fascinated about where those things overlap and where they have to stay very separate. But one thing I find fascinating is I think we as human beings, because we are storytelling creatures, we so often do tell ourselves stories, but we try to simplify them. And so often I look at some of the stories people tell and I'm like, well, that's the Hollywood version. I can hear the beginning, I hear the inciting incident, there's the turning point, there's the climax, there's the resolution. And it's a very simple linear story, right? One thing happens and all the dominoes fall. And how I just agree with you, Emily, that the world is so much more complex. And I guess I don't know if you have an answer for this, Amanda, but I'm curious, as someone whose job it is to help people understand these stories in a much deeper, more contextual way, do you have tips or tricks for how you tell these stories in a way that people can take in more of the threads instead of just this one perfect strand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things we're having a lot of national conversations now about history and how we think about history, and history is bad or history is good, or things that happened in history are bad or good, right? My take is that I'm always telling people history is more interesting when it's more complicated. That I'm not out here to tell you that this thing is whatever, is moralized or whatever. It's just so much more complicated. And if the best thing we can do is to complicate history so that people have that in their minds. Because one of the things I often say to people too is that human beings are messy, imperfect creatures. We have always been messy, imperfect creatures. We make decisions for reasons that are not in perfect line with the 5 points that you have to recite on your AP US history exam that led to X, Y, or Z. Someone made a decision because they woke up one morning and had a bad breakfast sometimes. And sometimes it was, in fact, the culmination of weeks of careful thought. And that when we look back and think about these things and have what feels like these same conversations over and over, there were education financing conversations in the 1860s and 70s. Mm-hmm. Back that far. It helps us feel, I think it helps us feel less lonely. And it helps us feel more like there are answers because there have been answers before, and maybe they weren't. Well, no answer lasts forever. The answer, we had to move on from those answers and figure out new answers, but we did get answers before, and we did make some progress and do some good things, and maybe things shifted and changed. So that feels both frustrating because why do we have to keep doing this? But also because human beings have continued to figure things out and continue to be human beings and relate to each other. And I think that's beautiful, and that's one of the best things we can learn from history.
I like that.
Oh, that's so wise. Thank you,
Yes.
Amanda. It's funny when as part of legislative orientation for new members, everyone is given a copy of that green book, Vermont State Government. And I have 4 copies of it for various things I have participated in. It has been the prize given, and I've tried to refuse it a few times, saying I have other copies, but no one will ever let me refuse the copy. So it mostly just serves as a pedestal, and sometimes I give it away to people. But I think very few of us read it. And that historical context is really essential to both like sort of the hope and the I don't know, effectiveness that you sort of described. Like, I guess I'll just stick with hope that you just described, like that you get from history, Amanda. And I just would love to figure out ways for you to actually just come do storytelling with the legislature about our own political history so people don't have to read the Green Tome and, in fact, or maybe to supplement the Green Tome. I'm really curious, a few times you've referenced so sort of, the Back to the Land movement had a spike in the 60s and 70s, but certainly had a huge spike in the 20s too, right? Or the co-op movement, the food co-op movement, spike in the 20s, another spike in the 60s and 70s. And I think there was even one previous to the 20s. I'm curious about, particularly here in Brattleboro, the arts and crafts community. I think we often also think of as like so deeply aligned with that migration in the 70s and the cultural shift in the 70s. But I also know that like the arts and crafts movement was named long before that, right? And I don't personally know how that fits into sort of Vermont's cultural or political history, and if it also has those sort of previous iterations the same way, say, the Hudson Valley does.
Yeah, I would argue similar previous iterations, right? That we do see sort of waves of artistic moments in Vermont history. Art history is not as much my strong suit, so I'm going to be a little bit general here. There have absolutely been moments in Vermont history. We often see a lot of literary flourishings in particular decades, and in particular, I think a lot of this has to do with community and where people end up gathering in a particular time and place and sort of connecting off of each other. We talked about Packers Corner earlier, right? That's near Brattleboro. That is a very much a literary focused community, and we see quite a few artists coming out of this countercultural moment as well. But there's also a big push, as we described earlier, in the 20s and 30s. There's a big literary and artistic flourishing with these publication of these small chapbooks and journals and poetry collections and things like that among a small community of interconnected people. And then you can also see some similar moments in the 19th century. So I sometimes I think people get very bored when I'm like, no, it's happened before. This is just a different sort of iteration of it, the iteration that is closest to us. So you see that in other parts of the state as well. There were communities in the Northeast Kingdom that focused on dance and leatherworking. And they would do these incredible choreographed dances and work and then perform in other places. And they would rotate people back and forth between, I believe the store was in Connecticut for the leatherwork they would make in the community. And they would sell that to help fund their community.
When
so
was
they
this,
were
the
also
dance and the leather work?
the 70s. That's a 70s one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in the Northeast Kingdom. You see a flourishing at Goddard, for example, of artistic work. You see the design build communities of the Mad River Valley. That's part of this moment as well, that 1970s counterculture moment as well. The Frog Hollow Art Centers are founded in the 1970s. So there's absolutely a new flourishing of that with counterculture.
Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of keeping an eye on the clock. So, given all the stories, Amanda, that you hear about the 70s and the counterculture, what do you feel is really key for people to understand?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that a lot of the conversations we are having right now are conversations we have been having for a long time in Vermont history. They reached a peak in the 1970s. We've touched on a few times that real Vermonter question.
Mm-hmm.
We used to introduce kids to our exhibit in Montpelier with the question, who is a Vermonter? What do you think? Are you a Vermonter? What do you think makes you a Vermonter? And I had a little girl raise her hand once and said, well, my grandparents were born here and their grandparents were born here. She said, but I don't feel like I'm a real Vermonter. And I said, well, talk to me about that. She said, I really hate kale. And that was a 10-year-old explanation for like, she felt like she didn't fit in a way culturally. Like she was serious. So like for her, that was a part of the definition. And what is Vermont? And is there an essential Vermontiness? And how has that changed? And has a certain moment in Vermont's history as we were discussing earlier, saved or ruined it or changed it irrevocably. It's always changing. The whole idea of discussion of place and what is a place and how has it become that place, and the question of essentialism. Is there even an essential Vermont is a big one in history when we think about that. And I think that people point to the 1970s as a real peak moment for those conversations, because it felt like things were changing very quickly. They'd been changing very slowly, and then all of a sudden it became very visible. A lot of those slow background changes, and it probably felt like things were hugely changing and like things were in tumult. And frankly, nationally they were, right, in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of that is reflected back here as well. But as I said earlier, I do find it both frustrating and comforting that we continue to have these conversations. Are you a real Vermonter? My husband was born in Bennington. He's been told that wasn't really Vermont. Like, it's right on the border. Does it even really count?
Oh yeah, we get that down here all the time.
Yeah.
Yes.
I came here for college. I've been here for 20 years. I arguably know more about Vermont history than your average person who was born here. Am I a quote unquote real Vermonter? And what part of Vermont do you participate in? Like, what makes you that real Vermonter? If you're really into X or Y or Z, is that what makes you? We've been having these conversations forever, and they're often meant to parse out and to make a distinction in ways that feel punishing. And they were absolutely used that way occasionally in the 1970s, and are still, and they were used that way again in the 1820s and 30s, and so on and so forth. And like, to go really big, this is one of the questions about America too, right? Like, what is an American? Who is an American? How do we define that? It's a much bigger kind of existential question.
I think what I'm left sitting with in what you just said is that whole question of who's a Vermonter, and trying to divide people or parse things out. I think what's hitting me for the first time is an undercurrent in that question too, of who is Vermont made for and who is being served or left out, and whose needs are being met or not met. I think is something that I just hadn't quite seen as clearly in that discussion as I'm seeing now.
If I could add to that, one piece of that I'm really struck by lately is like what work means in the context of Vermont, and how sort of particular ways of working the land or being working class in the 70s got really sort of like reified and valorized, or
it's what's noble and what's not noble.
Yes. And, working an hourly shift at a grocery store is not considered sort of as noble or as hard a work or just as like worthy of attention as more like sort of outside labor. And I just think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle, for how that brings us into like who gets attention politically in these moments.
We have just a few minutes before we need to wrap up, and I know Emily needs to get to a meeting. Amanda, what do you want? I mean, there is so much here that we have pulled, so many strings we've pulled on, and it's, for me, a very delicious conversation, so thank you. But what do you want to leave listeners with?
I think I'll revisit that point I made earlier, just try to keep in mind that the history is just always so much more complicated, and it's more interesting when it's more complicated. Don't feel the need to make it make sense always. Just make it complicated.
And if you have a lot of great resources on your website, remind listeners where they can find some of these resources, what resources are available to them at the Historical Society.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go to vermonthistory.org, all spelled out, all one word. We are the state's historical society. We are an independent nonprofit, although we were created by the state legislature in 1838 by statute. And we have museum collections, objects, archival collections, a reference library, and a research center here on Barry. We have the State's History Museum right next to the State House in Montpelier with an exhibit on the history of Vermont. We also do educational programs for K through 12 students and research support for college and postgraduate students. We support the local historical societies. Vermont has 192 local historical societies across the state. We have the highest density of museums in the country. And we do a lot of other support and outreach around history, and we're the only organization that collects the entire history of the entire state of Vermont.
You're amazing.
No small feat there.
We keep busy for sure.
Emily, if people want to find more information on you or reach out, how can they do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you'll find links to my email, newsletter, sign up, social media, all the things. And if you live in Brattleboro, you can probably find me on your doorstep sometime soon.
Fantastic. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 p.m. Rebroadcast on Wednesday morning, wherever you find your podcasts, and of course on BCTV. Have a great weekend, everybody, and take care.